Hello and welcome to Fireside Fairytales. My name is Rory, and if you've never been here before, well, thank you for giving me a shot. What we do on this show is we read old folklore and fairy tales. Some of it recently translated, though that is not the case with this one. This is an older book. With, a little sound effects here and there, but we also have a live chat where you can join in and talk to people. There's already people talking about the stories you're hearing and things that are happening. My little crop of potatoes in there is usually a boisterous conversation partner. But if you're not watching live, then the big advantage that you have is you can just click it down in the description below, and there will be timestamps for the stories we're going to read. And what we're going to read today is sort of a series of stories. So there's going to be quite a few there, but we're going to kind of read them with little introduction between them, because there are quite a few. And they all relate to elves. So if you're watching this live, then you should join in the live chat and say hello, and I'd be happy to see you. If you aren't watching this live, though, you can jump over any kind of talking or story that you don't like and get to just stuff you're interested in. I see in the chat here we have GS saying good evening. Good evening, GS. Thank you for coming back. Zombie Wolf, good to see you. See your chat, PFP, I suppose. Tammy, I certainly hope you're feeling better than you were, though I suspect it'll take a little time. And Jum Store, it's good to see you as well. And I'm sure some more will trickle in as we go. Now, I was really indecisive about what to read here because I kind of like them all. This is actually the second time that I've considered reading this chapter, and that made it especially confusing because there were stories where I was like, I'm sure I've read these stories on stream before, and then I go back and I check everything, and I didn't. I just read them and then decided not to do that stream, because that happens sometimes. Some weeks I read a story and I'm like, that's it, and it takes me no time at all. But most weeks I read like 15 stories, and then I come up with like 6 different ideas for shows, and then I don't know what I want to do. So you're going to benefit from the from my indecision. I suspect this will be a long one. We'll see how it goes. Again, you can watch it in chunks if you don't have the time. I don't have too much to say about today's theme. I think it's pretty self-explanatory, especially if you're a regular viewer of the stream. But I'll do a little bit of catch-up in case you're not a regular viewer of the stream. We're going to read from Legends of Iceland by Jon Arnason, which is sort of the quintessential first major collected works of folklore on Iceland that is quite famous. It's from the 19th century. Jon Arnason is a figure of note in Icelandic culture and in folklore circles. And his first chapter of this book, Legends of Iceland, is entirely about elves. Now, all I guess I will say, just very briefly, is I'm gonna cover a couple of bases that I usually have to cover with this stuff. First of all, you need to leave your notions of what an elf is at the door, because you're going to get conflicting reports. There is a tendency, if you're new to folklore and legends, there's a tendency to view it through the specter of modern fantasy writing, where modern fantasy writing has a canon and it's fairly robust and consistent. That is not how folklore goes. We will see elves that are friendly spirits that help us for very clear reasons. We'll see elves that are friendly spirits who help us for unclear reasons. And then we'll see elves that seem pretty nice and then are murderous, horrible things that are, random by our perception and whatever else. They're all over the map because these stories come from all over the map. I swear I missed my calling as being a bad stand-up. Lizzie Rose is here. Hello, Lizzie Rose. But I think what specifically interests me about the Jon Arnason's collection here of the Legends of Iceland, he is making an attempt to sort of show some consistency, I will say, but the elves in general in Europe, in multiple cultures, as we've seen when we encountered them in Norwegian under the name of like Thórdur folk, which is going to be reflected here by, they call them Hid folk, but it's of a similar root. Or whether it's, you know, German elves or Celtic elves and fairy and fae and their various names within there. Or the Piskies of Cornish culture or whatever else. They occupy a strange middle ground in the cosmology of medieval Christianity and beyond. There's a lot of theories as to why that is, but this is interesting to me in this one, that they belong in this kind of middle ground. And I've sort of been toying around with these themes in our streams for the last little while. 2 weeks ago, I did a series of streams that seemed to be on Fae woman of the mountains of the German Alps, who were protectors of mountain goats and things like that. But they were seen as a sort of a function of the Christian God, which is unusual. A lot of the time, the Fae are seen as forgotten by the Christian God. But they're also not always seen as of the devil. Sometimes they are, and sometimes they aren't. And I think that's interesting because they are this sort of middle ground between the devil and God. And everybody is sort of trying to figure out in all these renditions of folklore, where did they come from and what sort of moral universe do they belong in? The gist of it is I think this this particular rendition from Jan Arnason opens with an account of where the elves come from, and it is a fascinating insight to the sort of metaphysics of at least Iceland, I suppose. I have not seen this account before. That said, I do want to make just a blanket apology to the entire culture of Iceland, of all the Icelandic people. This is entirely my fault, but I have the hardest time understanding the pronunciation of Icelandic words. And I'm sure it doesn't help that one of the main resources I have for figuring that out is Google Translate, which is not reliable. So I've done my best, practice some of these words and so on, as I usually do with streams. But in particular, if you are Icelandic, I'm sorry. Genuinely. This is me trying. And I would understand if you were like, I'm not listening to this. Okay. I think that's all I really wanted to say. So they all come from the same books. We're going to kind of read them as a big long stream. There's a couple of stories I'll skip. One, because it was too many content warnings, and I was like, what am I doing? Why am I even reading this at this point? It wasn't a bad tale, but it just functioned on such an icky premise. So we will be skipping at least one. We'll be skipping another one that we've already read on another stream. And if everything works out, we should end on a story that I think is pretty strong, but we'll see how it goes. I'm playing a little loose. I have a few things planned here. All right, folks. I'm going to take the music down just slightly. And then let's give ourselves a little bit of light rain. Our first story of the night, it's not really a story, but an account, a founder's tale of sorts, comes to us from the same place that all stories tonight are going to come to us. Jan Arnason's 19th century book, Icelandic Legends. And this particular story is called The Genesis of the Hid Folk, which is a word that finds similar root to the Thórdur folk and elves, in other words. Once upon a time, God Almighty came to visit Adam and Eve. They received him with joy, showed him everything they had in the house. They also brought their children to him to show him that these he found promising and full of hope. Then he asked Eve whether she had no other children than these whom she now showed him, and she said, "None." But it so happened that she had not finished washing them all, and being ashamed to let God see them dirty, had hidden the unwashed ones. This God knew well, and said therefore to her, "What man hides from God, God will hide from man." And these unwashed children became forthwith invisible, and took up their abode in mounds and hills and rocks. And from these are the elves descended. But we men from those of Eve's children whom she had been open and frankly shown to God, and it is only by the will and desire of the elves themselves that men can ever see them. Now a traveller once lost his way and knew not whither to turn or what to do. At last, after wandering about for some time, he came to a hut, which he'd never seen before. And on his knocking at the door, an old woman opened it and invited him to come in, which he gladly did. Inside, the house seemed to be a clean and good one. The old woman led him to the warmest rooms. Where were sitting two young and beautiful girls. And besides these, there were none else in the house. He was well received and kindly treated, and having eaten a good supper, was shown to bed. Let me just remind you that this stream is not explicitly for children before I continue this story. You make your call. He asked whether one of the girls might stay with him as his companion for the night, and his request was granted. And now, wishing to kiss her, the traveller turned towards her and placed his hand upon her, but his hand sank through her as if she'd been of mist, and though he could well see her lying beside him, he could grasp nothing but the air. So he asked what this all meant, and she said, "Be not astonished, for I am a spirit. When the devil in times gone by made war in heaven, he with all his armies was driven into outer darkness. Those who turned their eyes to look after him as he fell were also driven out of heaven. But those who were neither for nor against him were sent to the earth and commanded to dwell there in the rocks and mountains. These are called elves and hidfolk. They can live in company with none but their own race. They do either good or evil, which they will, but what they do thoroughly. They have no bodies as you other mortals, but can take a human form and be seen of men when they wish. I am one of these fallen spirits, and so you can never hope to embrace me." And to this fate the traveller yielded himself and has handed down to us this story. All right, that's a lot to take in right there. I'll give you guys a second, and I'll ask you, I'm going to continue the readings, obviously, but I'm going to ask you folks, which foundational story do you prefer? Do you like the one where Eve just didn't wash enough people and hid them from God, or do you like the ones where they didn't take a side in the war of the devil against God? Which one do you prefer for the foundational story of elves? Janera's here. That's lovely to see you, Janera. I'm going to drink some tea. What tea are you drinking tonight? And we'll carry on with the Fisherman of Götur. Jumpstore says, "Wow, is that typical of Icelandic hospitality?" I doubt it. It feels like more of a reference to a particular Bible story, if I'm being honest. Okay. Carrying on with our elf stories of Iceland. Again, this story comes to us from Jon Arnason's Icelandic Legends. And This is called The Fisherman of Götur. It is told that long ago a peasant living in Götur in Miðdalar went out fishing round the island of Dyrhólar. In returning from the sea, he had to cross a morass. And it happened once that on his way home after nightfall, he came to a place. It's a little loud. Where a man had lost his horse in the bog and was unable to recover it without help. The fisherman, to whom this man was a stranger, aided him in freeing his horse from the peat. When the animal stood again safe and sound upon the dry earth, the stranger said to the fisherman, "I am your neighbor, for I live in..." And Google Translate swears this is pronounced something close to Krumshil? I don't get it. I'm sorry if it doesn't. "For I live in Krumshil, and am as you returning from the sea. But I am so poor that I cannot pay you for this service as you ought to be paid. I will promise you, however, this much, that you shall never go to sea without catching fish, nor ever will you take my advice and return with empty hands. But you must never put to sea without having first seen me pass your house as if going towards the shore. Obey me in this manner, and I promise you that you shall launch at no time your boat in vain." The fisherman thanked him for his advice. And sure enough it was that for 3 years afterwards, never putting to sea till he had first seen his neighbor pass his door, he always launched his boat safely and always came back full-handed. But at the end of the 3 years, it fell out that one day in the early morning, the fisherman was looking out from his house and saw the wind and weather favorable, and all the other fishers hurrying down to the sea to make the best of so good a time. But though he waited hour after hour in the hope of seeing his neighbors pass, the man of Krumshil never came. At last, losing his patience, he started out without having seen him go by. When he came down to the shore, he found that all the boats were launched and far away. Before night, the wind rose, and it became a storm. And every boat that day that had been put to sea was wrecked, and every fisher in them drowned. The peasant of Götur alone escaped, for he had been unable to go out fishing. The next night he had a strange dream in which his neighbor from Krumshil came to him and said, "Although you did not yesterday follow my advice, I yet so far felt kindly towards you, that I hindered you from going out to sea, and saved you thus from drowning. But look no more forth to see me pass, for we have met for the last time." And never again did the peasant see his neighbor pass his door. Jumpstore says, "Lol, literally get wrecked." Lizzie Rose, responding to my question from the previous story, neither foundational story, elves and fairies are land spirits and ancestors, an old god and such. None of this Christian BS. It's a mix, I will say. The popular theory of the 19th century was that they were old pagan gods and spirits. There is reason to believe that a lot of that is true. Some of what informs that interpretation, though, is less than savory, I will say, without going into detail. Yeah. Them witches' words there. All right. What is the best cup of tea you've ever had? There's another question. Also, do you folks like fishing? I never really got a chance to do it. I'm sure we probably have some people that don't eat fish in the chat, but beyond that. Our next story is called The Grateful Elfwoman. It also comes to us from Jan Arnason's book here. A peasant's wife once dreamed that a woman came to her bedside whom she knew to be Hulda Kona, and who begged her to give her milk for her child, 2 quarts a day for the space of a month, and placing it always in part of the house which she pointed out. The good wife promised to do so, and remembered her promise when she awoke. So she put a milk bowl every morning in the place which the other had chosen, and left it there, always on her return, finding it empty. This went on for a month. And at the end of the month, she dreamed that the same woman came to her and thanked her for her kindness, begged her to accept the belt which she would find in the bed when she awoke, and then vanished. And in the morning, the good wife found beneath her pillow, a silver belt, beautifully and rarely wrought, the promised gift of the grateful elf-woman. Now that is some classic folklore there. You know, I've made this distinction before, but folklore doesn't always really have much of a story. It's more just my aunt once put some milk in the corner of the house and got a belt for it. Lizzie Rose says, I don't feel the need to fish. If I want to be alone in nature, I just go do it. Yeah, I'm a walker myself. Like, I hike and walk. Yeah, I think that might be what I would do as well, Zombie Wolf. Right. That's expensive, Genera, for the 1970s to buy a $5 lure. GS says, I loved hip fishing until a horsefly took a good-sized chunk out of my knee where the bait was. Oh, I know somebody who told a story of that. Horseflies can be really mean. All right. If you are watching the stream, you can see why I'm delaying on this first sentence. Just go ahead and read that first sentence. See how I do. Our next story is called Thórdur of Thrastastadir, I think. A certain man named Thórdur lived at Thrastastadir in Scythe. One day in the winter, he started from home intending to go to the trading town of Hofsós, but the snow had drifted so deeply that the way was thought unsafe. Not caring for this, he carried his merchandise in a bag and walked off across a bog, which he knew to be his shortest path to Hofsós. When he had gone a little way, he quite lost the track, but still walked straight on till nightfall, when he saw before him some warehouses so lofty and so beautiful that they filled him with surprise. Going up to them, he discovered a light in one of the windows, and at the same time he heard some delightful music. And so he looked in at the window and saw a number of people dancing. He then went to the door and knocked, and immediately it was opened by a well-dressed man who asked him what he would. Which I'm assuming is a turn of phrase we no longer have. Thórdur told him how he had lost his way and begged if it were possible for a night's shelter. "Come in, be welcome," said the man. "You shall have shelter here. Bring in your bag too, and tomorrow I will trade with you. I promise you that you shall not find the bargains of Hofsas better than mine." Thórdur could scarcely believe his ears, but thought he must be dreaming. So the man led him into the chief room, despite of Thordur's plain and muddy dress. There were many assembled there, the lady of the house, her children, and her servants, all gaily and brightly dressed and making a merry. The man who opened the door to Thórdur was no other than the master of the house, who said to the lady, "Wife, here is a man who has lost his way, and who needs both rest and food. Treat him well." "I grieve to hear of his distress," replied she, and rising, brought in a good and plentiful supper, which she set before Thórdur, while the master of the house fetched wine in glasses and begged Thórdur to drink with him. Thórdur did so, and thought he had never tasted such wine in all his life, nor ever met such goodly company, though he could not, for all that, help wondering at the strangeness of the adventure. Glass after glass of wine he drank, and by, becoming tipsy, went to bed and fell into a deep sleep. Well, the next morning at breakfast he was offered wine, even better than the night before. Having drunk it, was conducted by the master to the trading room, which was well fitted with every kind of merchandise. Then and there Thórdur showed the man his wares, and received from him in exchange more than half again what he would have gotten for them at Hofsas. With the money he bought corn and linen and many other small things at a much lower price than he was wont to pay elsewhere for the like, and filled with his sack. It's a very different meaning, I said, than what I said. When the trading was finished, the master offered him as a gift a cloak for his wife and cakes for his children, saying to them, "These and many other good turns shall you have at my hands, as tokens for my gratitude to you for having saved my son from death." Well, Thórdur wondered what the man could mean, but the other said, "Once you were standing under the rock called Thórdur Hofti, in company with other young men, waiting for a good wind to take your boat to Drongi. Your companions amused themselves by throwing stones against the rock, under which, as the sun was very hot, my son had laid himself down to sleep, for he was tired, having been up all the night. He bade them cease their sport, for it was a foolish one, you said, and a useless. They laughed at you for this notion of yours, and called you strange and fanciful for your pains. But had you not prevented them from throwing stones, they would have killed my son." After this, Thórdur took leave of all in the house, for the sky was now clear and the path good, and started on his homeward way, the master walking up some steps with him to wish him Godspeed. Thórdur marched on steadily for a while, but chancing to look back for the house wherein he had passed at night, he saw nothing of it, but in its place were the rocks of Thórdur. Then he understood that the kind merchant was an elf, hastening home, told his wife all that had befallen him, and gave her the cloak. As for the wares he gotten instead of his own, he showed them to all his neighbors, and never were the like of them for goodness seen in all that country, nor in any other country under the sun. It's interesting because the idea that, like, elves craft magical items is pretty prevalent in a lot of folklore, but the idea that elfin stuff is of a quality above, not just magical, but just not even, they're not magical, but they're just really good, is something that you see a lot in Tolkien's rendition of elves, but you don't see that so much in a lot of accounts of elves in various cultures, but you do see it in the Icelandic accounts. There's a couple of places where that idea comes up, that they are the best versions of it. And again, it's not exclusive. It's just a theme I see more often in Icelandic. And that makes sense because, as I've said before, Icelandic folklore is probably the most consistent touchstone for Tolkien's elves. I see some discussion about, whether to eat meat or not. But I also see Lizzie Rose saying, wine at breakfast, oh my. I was never much of a wine drinker. I don't drink anything anymore, but including water. No, I don't drink alcohol anymore, but I was never really a wine guy. I did drink it. I did try mead, and I liked mead. Although, what exactly do you mean by mead? Is a huge amount of variation. There's like really traditional Viking mead, which is basically water with a little bit of alcohol. That is probably more about sterilization of the water than anything else. All right. This one's about a sunnier world for sure. Carrying on with our Icelandic elf tales. Whew. I am definitely going to have to cut some stories. I'm not making the progress I was hoping. Gennaro says, I like two types of wine. Riesling and my pineapple chili wine from Stella Rose. Oh, wow. Tammy says, my friend made mead. It was very strong. Yeah, that's the thing about mead. It can be very, very strong and it can fizzy, or it can be very, very light. You don't see the light stuff as much anymore. That was more a thing they did for feasts. And again, we don't know for sure, but it does seem that a lot of like old ales and stuff like that, there was sort of two types. There was types that would mostly be drunk to get you drunk, but it seemed just as likely as like it was sort of a way of dealing with, you could get water and be fairly confident it wouldn't make you sick because the alcohol killed off a lot of stuff. So there was a lot more like watery stuff back then. Not that they didn't have strong stuff. When I did drink some wine, I always liked dry things. It was dry. The thing I preferred to drink was hard liquor. Like, I liked the taste of liquor. The next story is called The Magic Scythe. And as a content warning, I don't think it's too extreme, but at the end of the tale, there is spousal abuse. So if that is a triggering thing for you, just wait until mute the stream or something until it's not a very long story. But or if you're not watching live, skip to the next story, which is Grímsborg. A certain day laborer once started from his home in the south to earn wages for hay cutting in the north country. In the mountains, he was suddenly overtaken by a thick mist and a sleet storm and lost his way. Fearing to go on further, he pitched his tent in a convenient spot and taking out his provisions began to eat. While he was engaged upon his meal, a brown dog came into his tent, so ill-favored, dirty, wet, and fierce-eyed that the poor man felt quite afraid of it, and gave it as much bread and meat as it could devour. This the dog swallowed greedily and ran off again out into the mist. At first the man wondered much to see a dog in such a wild place, where he never expected to meet with a living creature. But after a while he thought no more about the matter, and having finished his supper fell asleep with his saddle for a pillow. At midnight he dreamed that he saw a tall and aged woman enter his tent. He who spoke thus to him, "I am beholden to you, good man, for your kindness to my daughter, but I am unable to reward you as you deserve. Here then is a scythe, which I place beneath your pillow. It is the only gift I can make you, but despise it not. It will surely prove useful to you, as it can cut down all that lies before it. Only beware of putting it into the fire to temper it. Sharpen it however you will, but in that way never." So saying, she was seen no more. When the man awoke and looked forth, he found the mist all gone, the sun high in heaven. So getting all his things together and striking his tent, he laid them upon the pack horses, saddling, last of all, his own horse. But on lifting his saddle from the ground, he found beneath it a small scythe blade, which seemed well worn and rusty. On seeing this, at once, he recalled to his mind the dream. And taking the scythe with him, he set out once more on his way. He soon found again the road which he had lost, and made all speed to reach the well-peopled district to which he was bound. And when he arrived at the north country, he went from house to house, but he did not find any employment, for every farmer had laborers enough, and 1 week of hay harvest was already past. He heard it said, however, that one old woman in the district, generally thought by her neighbors to be skilled in magic, aka a witch, and very rich, always began her hay cutting a week later than anybody else, and though she seldom employed a laborer, always contrived to finish it by the end of the season. When by any chance, and it was a rare one, she did engage a workman, she was never known to pay him for his work. Now the peasant from the south was advised to ask this old woman for employment, having been warned of her strange habits. He accordingly went to her house and offered himself to her as a day laborer. She accepted his offer and told him that he might, if he chose, work a week for her, but must expect no payment. "Except," she said, "you can cut more grass in the whole week than I can rake in on the last day of it." To these terms he gladly agreed and began mowing. and a very good scythe he found to be, which the woman had given him in his dream, for it cut well, and never wanted sharpening, and though he worked with it for 5 days unceasingly, he was well content too with his place, for the old woman was kind enough to him. One day, entering the forge next to her house, he saw a vast number of scythe handles and rakes, and a big heap of blades, and wondered beyond measure what the old lady could want with all of these. It was the 5th day, the Friday. When he was asleep that night, the same elf-woman who had seen upon the mountains came again to him and said, "Large as the meadows you have mown, your employer will easily be able to rake in all that hay tomorrow, and if she does so, will, as you know, drive you away without paying you. When, therefore, you see yourself worsted, go into the forge, take as many scythe handles as you think proper, fit their blades to them, and carry them out into that part of the land where the hay is yet uncut. There you must lay them on the ground, and you shall see how things go." This said, she disappeared, and in the morning the laborer, getting up, set to work as usual at his mowing. At 6 o'clock the old witch came out, bringing 5 rakes with her, and said to the man, "A goodly piece of ground you've mowed, indeed." And so saying, she spread the rakes upon the hay, and when the man saw, to his astonishment, that though the one she held in her hand raked in great quantities of hay, the other 4 raked in no less, each all of their own accord, with no hand to wield them. At noon, seeing that the old woman would soon get the best of him, he went into the forge and took out several scythe handles, to which he fixed their blades, bringing them out into the field and laid them down upon the grass which was yet standing. Then all the scythes set to work of their own accord, and cut down the grass so quickly that the rakes could not keep pace with them. And so they went on all the rest of the day, and the old woman was unable to rake in all the hay which lay in the fields. After dark she told him to gather up his scythes, take them into the house again, while she collected her rakes, saying to him, "You are wiser than I took you to be, and you know more than myself, so much the better for you, and for you may stay as long with me as you like." He spent the whole summer in her employment, and they agreed very well together, moving with mighty little trouble a vast amount of hay. In the autumn she sent him away, well laden with money, to his own home in the south. And next summer, more than one summer following, he spent in her employ, always being paid as his heart could desire at the end of the season. After some years he took a farm of his own in the south country, and was always looked upon by all his neighbors as an honest man, a good fisherman, and an able workman in whatever work he might put his hand to. He always cut his own hay, never using any scythe but that which the elf-woman had given him upon the mountains, nor did any of his neighbors ever finish their mowing before him. One summer it chanced that while he was out fishing, one of his neighbors came to his house and asked his wife to lend him her husband's scythe, as he'd lost his own. Well, the farmer's wife looked for one, but could only find the one upon which her husband set such store. This, however, a little loth, she lent to the man, begging him at the same time never to temper it in the fire, for that, she said, her good man never did. So the neighbor promised, and taking it with him, bound it to a handle and began to work with it. But sweep as he would, strain as he would, sweep and strain he did right lustily. Not a single blade of grass fell. Wroth at this, the man tried to sharpen it, but with no avail. So he took it into his forge, intending to temper it, for, thought he, what harm could it possibly do? But as soon as the flames touched it, the steel melted like wax, and nothing of it was left but a little heap of ashes. Seeing this, he went in haste to the farmer's house, where he had borrowed it, and told the woman what had happened. She was at her wits' end with fright and shame when she heard it, for she knew well enough how her husband set store by this scythe, and how angry he would be at its loss, and angry indeed he was. When he came home, he beat his wife well for her folly in lending what was not hers to lend. But his wrath was soon over, and he never again, as he never had before, laid the stick about his wife's shoulders. It's truly an bizarre ending. I don't know what to make of it. In the grand scheme of content warning spousal abuse, I would say it's not the worst. We've definitely seen much worse than that on this stream. Oh, Janera had to go. Well, Janera, thank you for dropping by. It was good to hear from you. All right. I should clarify. I suppose that sounds bad if you are not a regular viewer of the stream. We've seen ones where they just straight up like murder them and stuff them in boxes and stuff like that. Like, it definitely, you don't fare well if you upset your husband in these stories. But I think we know that history well. Or if you don't, I'm not editing it out for that reason alone. You should know that was the history. Zombie Wolf says he beat her with a stick. Yeah, I know. Brutal. I mean, I understand why he's upset. It certainly wasn't like hers to lend out, but yeah, GS says, well, he was a nice guy because he stopped beating her with a stick. Yeah, like, I do like how that's supposed to impress us. All right. GS says I'd be grabbing that stick. Yeah. I may have to write a new version of that story. It's the same story, except the last paragraph she grabs the stick and beats him in the face with it. And it's the magic stick. It allows her to defend herself. Okay. Here's how far off the mark I was. We have read 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. We're going on to our 6th story, which will probably have to be our last. And I intended to read 11 stories. I knew I was way off. I didn't think I would be that off. Okay. Maybe not our last story. This is a shorter one. I'm sorry. I know this is terrible watching. I'm just trying to see. I want to end on like a... Yeah. Okay. Here's what I'll do. I will read 3 more stories. GS says, oh, Rory. 2 of which are quite short. And 1 is a longer one, so we will go a bit over time. But it is, it's a story that I actually was intending to read near Christmas when I was first reading this book, and then I decided that it didn't really fit. About 2 brothers, which I swear I'd read before, but I looked up and down all my channels, or all my videos, and I didn't. All right. Sorry for that wasting of your time. Let's get back to it with a shorter story. Our next story is called Grímsborg. And it also comes to us from Jan Arnason's Icelandic Legends. In the North Country, near a farm called Scythe, stands a high and steep rock named Grímsborg. And it is said that in this wild castle, elves have dwelt for many ages, and that their chief has always been called Grími. Certain old folk, not long dead, used to declare that in their time 4 elves dwelled in Grímsborg, 2 men and 2 women, and that of these each pair went into church at Scythe when there was worship, leaving the others at home. And it happened that a bad season for a long time prevailing cut off the inhabitants of that district from their supply of food and drove them into the very jaws of death. Once during the famine, the farmer of Scythe, chancing to pass the elf castle, bethought of what hope might lie in appeal to the goodwill of the chief elf, and going close to the foot of the borg, said in a loud voice, "Rich Grímur, of the castle hear our sorrow, and of thy pity ere shall dawn tomorrow. Cast up beneath the rocks upon the shore a mighty whale that we may starve no more." Well, then he waited to hear if there should be an answer to these words, and in a few moments a voice came from the elf castle saying, "Whale, come to land, lie stretched upon the sand, in death that those who fear to die from famine find salvation nigh." And as soon as he heard these words, the farmer returned home joyfully, knowing that the days of famine were ended, since the elves vouchsafed their help. And next morning, going with a large band of men down to the beach, what should he see lying dead upon the rocks but a fine whale, which had been driven up by the surf in the night. So ended the famine of Scythe. For before the people had finished the flesh of the whale, the season changed and good days came back again. I do like that story because it does emphasize, the value of things like that to people past. Our next story. See, that was a short one. Our next story is also a short one. Our next story is called Old Beggar. It also comes to us from Jan Arnason's Icelandic Legends. Near a certain farm long ago, 3 children were playing on a grass mound, a little girl and 2 boys. After they had played for some time, the girl, who was the youngest of them, found a deep hole in the ground, so deep that she could not see the bottom of it. Stooping down, she thrust her hand into it and, shutting her eyes, cried out in fun, "This girl is way more brave than me. Would any of you do that? I wouldn't." Putting something, cried out in fun, "Put something into the palm of an old beggar, and old beggar shall not see." No sooner had she said the words than a large silver button was placed in her hand. And when the other children saw her good luck, and they were fit to burst with envy, and the eldest of them, stooping down, struck his hand into the hole and said, "Put something into the hand of an old beggar, and an old beggar shall not see." And for he hoped to get something at least as good as the little girl had got, if not better. But no, far from it. When he drew his hand out again, he only found that he'd lost the use of it, and what is more, never recovered it again. For the elf, who hated envy more than anything in the world, had given it a squeeze. It's a hell of a way to learn a lesson. All right. We will make this the last story of the night. It is a longer story. It is a tragic story. It is a violent story. Our last story of the night is called Túngustapi. And it also comes to us from Jan Arnason's Icelandic Legends. In the olden times, many years ago, a rich farmer lived at Thrastastadir. Of his children, 2 were sons by the name Arnur and Svein. These brothers were both full of promise, though as different in character from one another as night and day. Arnur was a brave, stirring, and active youth, and Svein a quiet, gentle, and timid one. Arnur was full of life and spirit, spent all his time in outdoor sports and games in company with the other young men who lived in that valley and who used to meet together at a rocky hill standing near the farm of Tunga, which was called Túngustapi. Their favorite amusement in the winter was to slide in sleighs down the snowy sides of the hill, and in the evenings the rock used to echo again with their shouts and merriment, Arnur always being the ringleader. Svein scarcely ever took part in their sports, but was wont generally to pass his time in the church and to wander alone about the foot of the hill, when the rest were not playing there, of course. People used to point at him and to say that he had to do with the elves who dwelt in the mountain. And certain it was that without fail every New Year's night he used to disappear. Nobody knew where he went to. He often warned his brother not to make such riot on the hill, but Arnur always laughed at him for his pains and said that no doubt the elves were none the worse for it, and as for stopping their sports on the hill, he saw no fun in that. And go on he would. And go on he did, just the same as ever, though Svein assured him over and over again that harm would come of this folly. One New Year's night, Svein had disappeared as usual, but stayed longer away from home than was his custom. Arnur offered to go and look for him, saying in a joke, "He is certainly enjoying the company of his friends, the elves." So starting out, he took his way to the mountain, and the night was dark and stormy. And when he had arrived at that side of the hill which faced the farm, the rock opened suddenly before him of its own accord, and he saw within endless rows of the brightest lamps. At the same time he heard the sound of music, and bethought himself that this must surely be the time for the elves' public worship. And drawing nearer, he came to an open door, through which he looked and saw vast crowds of people assembled within. One who seemed to be a priest stood dressed in splendid robes by an altar around which were placed numberless burning candles. Arnur then went further in still and saw his brother Svein kneeling before the altar, while the priest, laying his hands on his head, was speaking some words over him. Round about him stood many others, all in sacred robes, so that Arnur guessed at once that they were making his brother an elfin priest. Then he cried aloud, "Svein, come with me! You are running the risk of death!" Whereupon Svein started up, and turning towards the door near where his brother stood, made as if he would hurry to him, but the priest who stood before the altar said, "Shut instantly the door. Let us wreak vengeance upon the man who has dared to place his feet within our holy place. But thou, Svein, must go from among us for thy brother's fault. And inasmuch as thou wert willing to go to him, and loved more his shameless call than these, our sacred rites, thou shalt fall down dead
whenever thine eyes again see me standing in my robes before this altar.
Arnur now saw those who had been standing around the altar lift his brother in their arms and vanish with him through a distant arch of rock. At the same moment, a distant sound of a bell rang out above him, and all the crowd rushed with one accord to the doorway. He himself ran through it first, back into the outer night, and sped towards his home. But soon he heard behind him the sound of following feet, and the weird tramp of fleet elfin horses. One of the foremost riders cried with a loud voice,
"Ride, ride, ride on, for the slopes are dark and the path is dim. He flees before, ride after him. Let us the fell enchantment spread confusion o'er his feet and head, in order that he may never see tomorrow's sun. Ride, ride, ride on."
And then the whole troop rode between Arnur and the farm and drove him back. On they went over hill and rock and morass. Arnur, whose dread clogged his feet, knowing not whither he fled, at last came to the slopes far east of his home. And there, his strength forsaking him, he fell down fainting, and the whole elfin troop rode over him, bruising him with hooves of their goblin horses, till he was more dead than alive. As to Svein, he came home just when the household, tired of waiting, were going to bed. He did not utter a word about himself or his long absence. But bade them at once make search for his brother Arnur. Servants therefore went out and spent the rest of the night, vainly trying to find him. But he was found at last by a farmer who lived to the eastward, and who, as he rode to early worship at Tunga next morning, stumbled across him lying at the foot of the slopes. Arnur was sensible, but dying, and so weak that he only found strength and words to tell the farmer what had happened, and to beg him not to take him home again, but leave him before he fell back dead. And ever since that, those mounds have been called the Slopes of Death. Svein was never himself again, but became more sullen, silent, and strange than he had been before. And it was noticed from that time forth he neither went near nor looked towards the rocky mountain Túngustapi. He seemed to care no more for worldly things, and at last gave them up with their interests forever by becoming a monk, shutting himself up in the monastery of Helgafell. He was so learned that none of the brethren were by any means a match for him, and he sang the mass so sweetly that the like of it, they said, had never been heard before. So they looked on him with awe, and as on one who is not of this world. And he was, as it were, head over them all. Now, after a while, his father at Tunga, being far on in years, fell sick for the last time. And yearning to see his son before he died, he sent for Svein to come to him. Svein at once obeyed the bidding, but as he departed, said sadly to the monks who had assembled to wish him Godspeed, "May it fare well with you all forever, for perchance I may never come back with life again." He arrived at Tunga the Saturday before Easter, and he found his father so void of strength to be scarcely able to speak. But the old man made it understood that he wished his son to sing the Mass an Easter day in the church, whether he himself would be carried to die. Svein, strangely loth, consented, but only on condition that the church door should be kept firmly shut during the whole service, for upon the fulfillment of this something told him that his life depended. Easter morning arrived. And the dying man was borne by his servants into the church. Then Svein, attired in his priestly robes, stands upon the steps of the altar and sweetly sings the Mass. So sweetly that all there present think that never before have they heard a voice like this, and they kneel with the very breath hushed upon their lips to listen to him the better. But when, at the close of the service, the priest turns from the altar and with outstretched hands pronounces solemnly the blessing, suddenly a strong wind from the west strikes the church, and the door, bursting from its fastenings, falls heavily inwards. All turn to look, and they see through the empty frame that the rocky hill near at hand yawns open, and that within it gleam of countless rows of burning lamps. And when they turn again towards the altar, Svein had fallen down and lie dead, where he had just pronounced the blessing. And his father had fallen also from his couch, his face likewise white with death. Then the people knew whence the west wind came, and how Svein had been slain by the vengeful elves. For the farmer who had found Arnur at the foot of the slopes has long ago told them that story, and they whisper to one another that Svein has seen the elfin priest standing robed at his altar. So the father and son were buried on the same day. But the church at Tunga now stands elsewhere, that it may be out of sight of the elfin temple, in whose altar is to the west, and whose door to the east. Jumpstore says, sensible but dying. I think I'm going to file that away for you to use one day. I had this similar thought. It was such a strange turn of phrase. Panic-stricken man. How's my father? Me. Sensible? Oh, thank God. Me. But dying. Man, what? There's a long conversation about automatic doors that I'm not going to scan back up, but I do know that Zombie Wolf gave us a fact about pigeons. Random trivia from Zombie Wolf, who usually likes to give us a piece of random trivia each stream. The Chinese army has 10,000 trained pigeons in the event war renders modern technology useless. They can fly up to 75 miles per hour while carrying loads up to 3.5 ounces. Yes, I mean, that used to be the main mode of communication, didn't it? Pigeons and various other trainable birds sending messages. That and messengers. But, yeah. That and flags, actually. Flags. The lost art of communicating troops movement with the flags. Anyhow. The ones I didn't read were Blueface, Bishop and the Elves, and the Man Whale. And of those, I think Man Whale is the one I'm most sad I didn't get to read today, but I'm sure I will find another time to read them. But this has been a discussion of Icelandic legends around elves. These are stories of elves. And as you can see, they have their own distinct qualities in Icelandic lore that differ quite greatly. Gemstora says, thought you were going to mention smoke symbols, Rory. Yeah, smoke symbols were also used to communicate. Yeah, that is true. I mean, there's a few different ways we used to do it, for sure. Smoke symbols and flags and stuff, though, can only really communicate preset things, right? So the advantage of the birds was you could send an actual message. Anyhow, that's not why we're here, to listen to my half-remembered history of the world. If you enjoyed this, there is a whole playlist of Fireside Fairytales stories. If you like the idea of helpful spirits, I think it didn't do too well on the algorithm side, but that's not too unusual. The stories about the three maidens of the Alps, I think, is of a similar tenor and tone as this. But yeah, I think just looking back, I didn't get to all the versions of the elves that we see. I also removed the stories about elves replacing your children or kidnapping children or things like that, changelings and so on, mainly because I think I could probably make another stream out of that, although I've always been kind of... at some point I will do a changeling stream, but the problem, of course, is that the entire concept of a changeling is a bit of a fraught history of families not dealing well with neurodivergent children. So I'm mindful of that, but it is a consistent thing across multiple cultures. So at some point I will do a stream on changelings. So I didn't put the changeling stories in, but for just looking forward. But the elves in Iceland do swap children and stuff like you see in Celtic tales, and I didn't put in some of the more how do I put this generously? I mean, not generously, without saying too much or whatever. Let's just say some of the stories about elves have a different concept of consent than we might. And I didn't put those in because I just don't think those play well. I don't even mean like they're popular. I just think it's not very entertaining to read. It's just disturbing. Yeah, there are lots of other stuff that we've gone through here, but what I will say is I particularly like the contrast here, which I didn't get to fully flesh out, of elves will give you really helpful stuff, help you go and find all the fish you need, and give you the scythe that gets you everything you want from a witch, but also are so angry that you would come into their temple that they would kill your brother, and they would hold a grudge and blow the door off your church and kill your father and kill you, and all this stuff, like just so angry. And there are actually other Icelandic books that I've read from where the elves are genuinely brutal and terrifying, and I like that contrast. Jumpstore is talking about the many things about, like, for example, the boiling the water with eggshells. Yeah, I think I actually read a German story that had that as the premise, like 2 years ago or a year and a half ago or something. Yeah. They are fun stories if you don't think about the implications of them too much. Anyways, I'm rambling on an already long stream. If you enjoyed this, if you enjoy the company of chat or myself or whatever else, we write stories on every Thursday, on the Varietal Show. We play solo tabletop RPGs of many different forms, and we use that as a prompt to write short little stories or introduction to stories or character arcs and whatever else. And I think it's a good time, even if you don't want to join in on the writing, which I suppose isn't for everybody. Just jump into the end and seeing what we came up with, or if you like solo tabletop RPGs, jumping in at the beginning to see what game I've unearthed that week. I have stuff planned for Thursday for a change, but I guess I'll keep it a surprise. Lindsay Rose says, yep, can't think about it too much. I mean, you can, but if you're just trying to come to a stream and relax and hear a story, don't think about it too much. Anyways, the If one didn't know better, it would seem that I don't want to let you go. But I am going to let you go. I will keep the fire warm, chat. Thank you for watching. Have a good sleep.